Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk about the pretty spicy Dr. Mundo and Soraka changes that are being discussed on Twitter right now, and which I believe are going to be going live on the PvE before too long, and sort of revive a topic of conversation I've had previously, which is that Grievous Wounds as a system is a relatively difficult to balance, if not impossible to balance, mechanic that I think either needs large changes made to it or needs to be removed from the game entirely. And this sounds pretty extreme, but I think that when you kind of hear where I'm at, I think this might make a little bit more sense. So if you haven't seen the changes, these are sort of changes to Soraka and Dr. Mundo in a similar vein to a lot of those other changes I've discussed previously that Riot do for champions that are on the borderline to try and make them more palatable for professional players and sort of options that they want to play potentially more often, right? Like they're borderline, they're super close, so Riot are kind of looking for opportunities to get these champions into a place where maybe they'll be a pro staple. And in that regard, the Soraka and Dr. Mundo changes are both aimed at essentially removing, if not mitigating at least, their weakness to Grievous Wounds. The Soraka changes, her W healing has been nerfed very, very slightly at maximum rank, but the biggest thing here is that Wish is now removing Grievous Wounds in all targets before it applies the heal, because this is an instantaneous application. It means that even if you have a dot on you that is also applying Grievous Wounds like Ignite, it doesn't matter because it's instantaneous, so before Grievous can tick again, it ends up adding it automatically. So in that regard, it basically removes that ability's interactions. The other thing that this is going to help with is that it just means you're always guaranteed full value from Wish. And then Dr. Mundo, instead of gaining 20% missing health upon activation of his ultimate, he's instead going to be gaining up to 25% scaling with rank of the ability, bonus health upon activation. Now, because this is going to work in a similar fashion to how Lulu Wild Growth works, it is not going to be reduced at all by Grievous Wounds. It's just going to be a complete increase in health, because it's not a heal, right? He's just getting more health, and therefore it gets around Grievous Wounds entirely. And so the fact that these abilities are being basically given mechanics to have them function around the presence of Grievous Wounds, I think is an indication that Grievous Wounds as a system is too readily accessible and too good at what it does. And this kind of gets back to the argument I had years ago, where I discuss Grievous Wounds, and I basically kind of say, Grievous Wounds are tricky because it's hard to tell how good a champion's healing can be, and it makes healing more swingy, because a champion, you don't want to have an opponent say, I can buy an 800 gold item and completely negate your champion pick, right? That feels bad, which then means that the healing that you have on the champion kit innately, if the champion is about healing, right? Your Dr. Mundos, your Sorakas, your Aatroxes, your Vladimirs, right? They're all about healing. So you want to make sure these characters still have the ability to do their thing, even in the presence of an 800 gold purchase being made by an opponent. So Riot then ends up over buffing the heal a little bit, so that way the champion heal still functions maybe a little bit weaker than normal, but still fairly efficiently under Grievous Wounds. But then that means if Grievous Wounds aren't present in that particular encounter, that the heals end up being massively overpowered to the point that Grievous Wounds stop becoming an opt-into, maybe this helps me in certain matchups, and becomes sort of a necessity, right? You have to have Grievous Wounds because otherwise the champion heal's been amped so high that there's no possible way you can defeat them otherwise. And this is essentially a problem I have with how Grievous Wounds function, because it does make it hard for these heals to be balanced. It means that essentially the game check becomes, did you buy Grievous Wounds as the counterplay for the character, as opposed to any other forms of counterplay, and then it doesn't feel good for those champions. And part of the problem as well is that with the current state of the game and the ready access to 60% Grievous Wounds, it ends up being very, very easy to opt into that and really negate a champion whose entire purpose for existence and entire playstyle is all about having high healing, because 60% is incredibly accessible. And for those of you who are saying, well, hey, it's fine to, have counter build options and have these sort of narrow use items that are nonetheless powerful in the correct circumstances, something like QSS into Malzahar, for example, I would argue that's not quite the same, right? Where Malzahar and Mordekaiser are countered by QSS in some degree or another. The difference there is that QSS is a fairly gold inefficient item. You have to be getting value from the active in order for this item to be worth it at all. It's 1300 gold, which for a lot of mages, for example, in the Malzahar matchup, that would be a lost chapter, for example, if you choose to rush an item, right? If you're going to make sure you get your QSS early on so you can avoid the flash R play with a gank, then you're not going to have a lost chapter, which is a massive power spike, and you're opting into an item that's fairly narrow in its applications and not that good of an item, and that you're not even going to upgrade, which hurts you way more in this current item system than it did previously, because It's not going to turn into a legendary item for mages, right? There are only 2 options for things that QSS actually builds into. So for mages sitting on it, they're denying themselves some of the value from their mythic passive. They're sitting on an item that's never going to be upgraded or give them more stats. And just in general with how the item system works, later stage items are more gold efficient than components, which means that you're sitting on a less gold efficient item than you could be overall because you have to buy this item early on, which generally means that you need to be getting value from QSS, but you're happy to have it when you do. Conversely, let's take a look at Grievous Wounds, which all cost essentially 800 gold, and which, yeah, they're pretty narrow, but they all build into items that you're actually pretty happy to buy at some point, right? Morellonomicon or Chempunk Putrifier or Executioner's Calling, or not Executioner's Calling, Mortal Reminder. These are all items that you're actually fairly happy to have. You don't feel bad about having to buy these items. You're sort of like, yeah, okay, that's fine, right? I don't care. And that, I think, is part of the problem I have with the way this has been balanced out, right? In that these items are not thought process, right? It's just spend 800 gold, get your Grievous, and therefore you counter these healing champions, and that then means that Riot have to continue trying to figure out a way to balance these healing champions around the fact that there is so much heal cut in the game, and it just makes it difficult for them to balance. Now, in the case of Dr. Mundo and Soraka, I don't necessarily think this is incredibly tragic, as these champions, like, their whole identity is healing, right? Dr. Mundo's only durability is his ability to heal, and Soraka's entire kit is about healing. She doesn't provide almost any value if she can't heal. So in that regard, these changes, I feel, are fair for those champions, but I also feel like it may make sense for Riot in the future to, again, consider removing Grievous Wounds as a system, but keeping it in the game in some forms. And here's sort of what I mean by that. So if you remove Grievous Wounds as a system, right, you can't buy Grievous Wounds in the shop, which means that you can't opt into it at a will, right? You kind of have to go into a game expecting there to be Grievous Wounds, or expecting Grievous Wounds to be necessary, and making appropriate choices in advance. What this means is that heals can generally be toned down, which means that if you don't have Grievous Wounds, that there'll still be a fair amount of healing for you to opt into. And this also means then that you can make smarter choices in champion select and still have the ability to counter a champion, as opposed to, I spent 800 gold, therefore you don't get to exist. And here's sort of what I mean. So first, we do have it in at least one systemic system, which is Ignite. So you can always opt into Ignite if you know you're going to be up against a high healing champion. So you know you're against Mundo top lane, you're taking Ignite, or you just know Mundo's in the game, so you're going to be taking Ignite on 1 or 2 champions on your team to make sure you have ready access to it. Ignite's a little bit better than these items because it can't be applied constantly. It's single target, it's got a long cooldown, it only lasts for a certain period of time, so you need to get a lot of use out of it when it happens. And in that regard, if they were going to do this, I would say you could even raise Ignite to 50 or 60% Grievous Wounds for the duration, because then it's one of your only sources of Grievous. But the other thing Riot could do is look to add Grievous Wounds to champion kits more than they've already done. I know they did add 60% Grievous to Kled and Katarina a while back, but I also think that there are a lot of champions that lost access to just sort of arbitrary Grievous Wounds a while back, and you could stand to give them back Grievous Wounds, right? Like Misfortune W or Tristana E, I could theoretically see as good places to add back Grievous Wounds. You could also find other champions in other lanes to add Grievous Wounds to, so something like Kindred proccing their E, for example, maybe that applies Grievous Wounds, or maybe Aatrox stabbing you gives back the Mutilator effect, which reduces the amount of healing and shielding that you receive. And that way, you can sort of opt into it at a champion level, right? If you see the fact that there is a Dr. Mundo or a Soraka in a game that you're about to play, you can opt into Grievous Wounds, and, in your champion pick by saying, oh, it's Dr. Mundo, so I'm going to pick Kled into this matchup. If you pick second, you still have the fallback option of saying, I'm going to grab Ignite here, or other champions on your team can say, oh, well, that's a Dr. Mundo. Sorry, you can't do much about it in lane, but I at least can pick up, let's say, Varus and be able to apply Grievous Wounds to him. And in that regard, I feel like there's a lot of advantages you can have in terms of champion select, and I feel like it generally makes Grievous Wounds less mandatory, and it makes it feel better overall to play as the healing champion, because now you're not adding in random arbitrary mechanics to give you additional benefits, right? Or to remove remove the counterplay of Grievous Wounds. You just don't have to worry about them, and you can just keep the champion kit simple. So I hope this made sense to you guys. I hope it kind of makes sense for why I'm saying Grievous Wounds is going to be tricky to balance. I think it would be easier for Riot to just remove it at this point. I understand why they keep it, but I do think at this point, guys, it makes sense to just take it out as a system and to find other ways of doing it. But let me know what you think of any of this down in the comment section below, or what you think of these Soraka and Dr. Mundo changes. Maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here, so let me know all that down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.